Yo.
When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart sank, not from fear of being caught, but because I realized which messages he was about to read. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I lunged to grab the phone, but he pulled it back swiftly, his eyes locked on the screen. I watched his face contort as he read, line after line, and felt my entire world crumbling in slow motion. Yes, he would discover the truth. But not the full truth. Not the parts that mattered most. His hands began to tremble as he flipped through the messages, and I knew he was seconds away from the one that would destroy everything. The one that said more than I ever dared speak. Or maybe, the one that would confuse him beyond repair. Then, my phone buzzed in his grip. A new notification appeared. I saw the name, and so did he. His face went pale. He froze, not even blinking. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I developed in childhood when anxiety choked me silent. My nerves burned under my skin as a cold wave of dread washed over me. His breathing changed. I heard it. Even from across the room. Deep, uneven, rapid. That was the moment I feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One I can never take back. A mistake that changed everything. And now I had no idea how to fix what I'd broken. But let me tell you how it all happened. Before I reveal the secret I've buried so carefully, tell me, have you ever kept something hidden, desperately hoping no one would find out, only to fail in the end? Comment below where you're watching from, and share that one truth you thought you could hide forever. There was nothing wrong with my life. Not on the surface, anyway. The fridge was always full. The mortgage was paid. The man I married still kissed me on the forehead every morning. But sometimes, something can be too smooth, too quiet. Like when you stare at a clean wall and start to wonder if it's always been that bland or if you've simply stopped noticing it. That's how it started. With silence. Not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that stretches long and hollow. A silence made of things we stopped saying, touches that never happened, glances that used to linger and now just passed through like wind. I'd stopped wearing perfume in the mornings. Stopped looking at myself in the mirror past brushing my teeth. Stopped asking how his day was, because I already knew the answer. Busy. Fine. And yet, if you'd asked me back then if I was happy, I would have said yes. Without blinking. Because the alternative meant digging into something I wasn't ready to admit. I think that's why I signed up for yoga. I didn't want fitness. I wanted something that was mine. Something separate from grocery lists and dry cleaning reminders and, did you turn off the stove? Something that reminded me that I had a body. That I had breath. That I still took up space in this world, not just in our home. The first day I walked into that studio, I felt ridiculous. I was older than everyone by at least 15 years. Their bodies moved like they remembered being alive. Mine moved like it remembered being tired. I set up my mat at the back of the room, where I could disappear. And then, I noticed him. Noticed, not stared. That's the word I use, but the truth is, I stared. He looked up from his mat and nodded at me politely. There was nothing flirtatious in it. Just a nod. A kind gesture. But it caught me off guard. It had been a while since anyone had looked at me like that, not like I was a mother, or a wife, or a woman in her 50s, but just a person. A presence. I told myself I was overthinking it. That I was just emotionally dehydrated. That evening, I told my husband about yoga. He nodded mid-scroll on his phone and said, "That's great. You need something for you." I smiled and walked to the kitchen. I didn't mention the nod. The following sessions were easier. I started to feel the rhythm of the room. My body stopped protesting as much. And he kept showing up, always 2 mats away. We never spoke, except once, when I stumbled in a pose and he helped me regain balance with a quiet, "You've got this." 3 words. But they stayed with me all day. Like he'd seen me. Not the struggling pose. Me. I came home that day with sore legs and a mind full of static. I took longer than usual in the shower. I watched the water slide off my skin and realized how long it had been since I'd really felt anything on my skin. I tried to remember the last time my husband touched me without a purpose attached to it, sleep, comfort, routine. I couldn't. The next morning, I got dressed for class early. I put on a pair of leggings I hadn't worn in years. They weren't even that flattering anymore, but they made me feel aware of my shape. I added a hint of mascara, almost laughed at myself in the mirror, but didn't wipe it off. At the studio, he arrived a few minutes late. Our eyes met. He smiled. That smile had no subtext, and yet my chest tightened. After class, I lingered, pretending to roll up my mat slowly. He did the same. When we stepped out into the parking lot, he was holding 2 coffees. "I guessed oat milk," he said, handing me one. I laughed. "Lucky guess." "Lucky instinct," he replied. We stood in that awkward stillness, coffee in hand, sunlight making everything seem too real. He asked where I lived. I hesitated, but not for the reason I should have. I was afraid of saying yes too quickly. I gave the name of the street. He nodded. "It's on my way." And then I was in his car. The seat warmer on. The windows cracked just enough. The music soft. He asked about my favorite books. I asked about his work. Nothing deep. Nothing bold. But I noticed his hands on the wheel. The way he glanced at me briefly when I laughed. He stopped outside my house. "I can walk from here," I said, suddenly unsure. "You don't have to," he replied. But I opened the door. I stood on the pavement. And then turned back. "Thanks for the coffee," I said. He leaned slightly forward. "You're welcome." The air felt different. Electric, almost. Like the second before lightning. We didn't touch. Not then. But something in me woke up. Inside the house, everything was normal. Dishwasher humming. A grocery bag on the counter. My husband in his office, typing. He didn't look up when I entered. Just said, "You're back?" "Yes," I replied. And walked straight to the bedroom. I lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I wasn't in love. But I was awake. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The next few days passed with a heaviness I couldn't shake. I kept going to yoga, not because I felt like it, but because I didn't know what else to do. It had become more than a class, it was an anchor. A place where I could breathe without being watched. Except now, I was being watched. Every time I walked in, I felt his eyes follow me. He never said anything. Just nodded, like before. But something had shifted. We weren't strangers anymore. I told myself it was nothing. A nod. A coffee. A ride home. But my body didn't agree. I found myself choosing my leggings more carefully, adding a dab of perfume before heading out. At first, I told myself it was just self-care. I was finally doing something for myself. But I knew better. Deep down, I knew exactly why I wanted to look a little better. Feel a little better. I was craving attention. But not just any attention, his star. That Friday, after class, I lingered outside longer than usual. Pretended to tie my shoe twice. He walked past me once, then circled back. I'm heading your way again, he said, like it was no big deal. I should have said no. I knew I should. But instead, I said yes. In the car, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. Words would have broken it. The radio played something slow and soft, the kind of song you only really notice when the mood fits. I kept my hands in my lap, trying not to fidget. When we stopped in front of my house, I didn't move. Neither did he. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, he turned his head to me. And just like that, we kissed. I don't remember who moved first. I don't remember if it lasted 2 seconds or 10. All I remember is the sensation, light and terrifying, like standing on the edge of something vast and irreversible. I pulled back first. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. My heart was pounding, not from joy, but from fear. Not fear of being caught, but fear of what it meant. What I had just allowed. I shouldn't have, I whispered. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, steady and unflinching. That silence told me everything. This wasn't an accident. This was a shift. A door had opened. I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me without another word. The sound of it echoed louder than I expected. Inside, everything was exactly as I left it. My husband's briefcase on the counter. The laundry still in the dryer. I stood in the kitchen, holding the edge of the sink, trying to catch my breath. My lips still tingled, as if trying to remind me that what just happened wasn't a dream. I splashed cold water on my face. Then again. And again. Later that night, I sat on the edge of our bed while my husband brushed his teeth. He walked out of the bathroom, drying his face with a towel, and glanced at me. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, too quickly. He sat beside me and rested his hand on my knee. A gesture that should have comforted me, but instead made my stomach twist. I wanted to cry. Not from guilt, but from confusion. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I didn't know who I was trying to be. That night, I lay in bed next to him, staring at the ceiling. His soft snore beside me, the familiar scent of his skin, the warmth of his body, it should have made me feel safe. But all I could think about was how different it felt from earlier that day. The next morning, everything was too bright. Too normal. I made coffee. Toast. Folded laundry. Watered the plants. And yet, every movement felt like a performance. Like I was pretending to be the version of myself my husband expected to see. A version I wasn't sure existed anymore. I checked my phone more than usual. No messages. Nothing from him. Part of me was relieved. The other part, disappointed. That afternoon, my son called. He said he'd be coming home for the weekend. Said he missed us. I smiled into the phone, but inside I froze. Because I knew what would happen. He'd bring his friend. Him. Of course he would. I spent the next 2 days in a haze. Cleaning. Cooking. Re-cleaning. Pretending I wasn't waiting. But I was. And when the door finally opened and I heard my son's voice, my heart skipped. "Mom. We're here." "We." I turned the corner, and there he was. Standing in my living room. Backpack slung over his shoulder, smile on his face, as if nothing had ever happened. My son hugged me. I held on too long. We sat down for dinner. I had made too much food. My husband poured wine. Laughed. Told stories from his work. I nodded and smiled, watching the three of them, the man I married, the boy I raised, and the man I kissed, talk like old friends. I couldn't taste the food. I couldn't follow the conversation. I felt like I was underwater, everything distant and muffled. After dinner, my son and his friend went out to meet other friends in town. I said I was tired. Needed to lie down. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, staring at my hands. They didn't feel like mine. Nothing did. Later that night, I heard the front door. Footsteps. Quiet laughter. Then silence. I imagined them settling into the guest rooms. I imagined him lying just a few feet from me, on the other side of a wall. I barely slept. In the morning, I avoided everyone. Said I had errands. Drove aimlessly for an hour. Stopped at a park. Sat on a bench. Watched people walk their dogs, jog, feed ducks. I felt invisible. And somehow, that felt right. Because I didn't know who I was anymore. A wife. A mother? A woman who made a mistake? Or someone who had finally woken up? And if I had woken up, was it too late to go back to sleep? The day after they arrived, everything felt more fragile. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, careful not to let anything slip, not the dishes from my hands, not the thoughts from my face. I cooked breakfast like I always did. My husband made jokes about how full the house felt again. My son told me how good it was to be home. And he sat across from me at the table, drinking coffee from the same mug he used the last time he stayed over. It was unbearable. He didn't speak to me directly, not even once. But I felt his eyes on me when no one else was looking. I kept my focus on the pan, on the plates, on the rhythm of household routine. It was the only thing I could control. Later, my son suggested they go out to the park for a walk. My husband stayed behind, too tired after a long week. I told them I had errands, that I'd catch up later. The truth was, I couldn't breathe with him so close. I took the long way to the grocery store. Walked through every aisle even though I only needed milk. I stared at the labels on jars, not reading anything. My thoughts kept circling back to the night in the car. To the look on his face when we kissed. To how easily it happened, and how impossible it felt now. Back home, I sat in my car for 10 minutes before going inside. I tried to will myself back into the version of me that had existed before all of this. The one who could sit at a table with her family and feel whole. But that woman felt like someone I used to know. Someone I had already buried without even realizing. That evening, I found them all in the living room. My son sprawled on the floor, laughing. My husband in his armchair with a drink. And him, leaning on the back of the couch, relaxed like he belonged. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unseen. I watched their world unfold without me, like I was peering through glass. When he finally looked up and saw me, his smile faltered just slightly. It was enough. I turned away before anyone else could notice. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked to the kitchen for water, and the silence of the house was crushing. I stood at the sink, staring into the dark garden beyond the window. Then I heard footsteps. Soft ones. He stepped into the kitchen, pausing when he saw me. I didn't speak. Neither did he. He walked to the other side of the kitchen, opened the fridge, took out a bottle of water, and poured a glass. Every movement was slow, cautious. I felt the air shift as he stood a few feet away, saying nothing, just breathing in the same silence as me. Then, as if he couldn't bear it anymore, he spoke. I didn't know he was bringing me here. He just said home for the weekend. I swear. I nodded. I believed him. But that didn't change what had happened. What was happening? He stepped a little closer, still holding the glass of water. I'm sorry, he said, softer this time. I looked down at the counter. My hands were trembling. I clenched them into fists and kept my voice low. You should go back to bed. He hesitated, then placed the glass on the counter and left. The door closed quietly behind him, but its echo stayed long after. The next day, my son asked if we could do a family dinner before they left. Said it had been too long since we all sat down together. I forced a smile and agreed. My husband nodded enthusiastically. We'll do it right, he said. Like the old times. I spent most of the day preparing. Cooking was the only thing that kept me grounded. The motions were familiar. Chop. Stir. Bake. Season. I lost myself in it. In the smell of garlic and thyme. In the clatter of utensils. When the table was finally set and everyone gathered, I tried to pretend. Tried to be present. But every sound felt too loud. Every laugh too sharp. My husband poured the wine. My son toasted to being home. And across from me, he raised his glass, eyes avoiding mine. After dinner, the others moved to the living room. My son turned on a movie. My husband dozed off in his chair. I stayed behind in the kitchen, cleaning dishes that didn't need cleaning. I heard footsteps. Not loud. Just enough to signal his presence. He stopped in the doorway and watched me scrub an already clean plate. I'll be leaving tomorrow, he said. I nodded. Should I stay somewhere else next time? I didn't answer. I just kept scrubbing. My hands were raw, the skin around my nails red from the hot water. I didn't mean to complicate your life. That made me stop. I turned around slowly, still holding the towel. You didn't complicate it, I said. It was already complicated. You just showed me where the cracks were. We stood in silence again. Finally, he left the room. Later that night, when I climbed into bed, my husband rolled over and kissed my forehead. You were quiet today, he murmured. Tired, I said. But I wasn't tired. I was unraveling. The next morning, they packed up and left. My son hugged me tight, told me he'd call in a few days. I nodded, smiled, waved as they drove off. When the door closed behind me, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful or hollow. It was heavy. Like the house was holding its breath. I walked through the living room, touched the back of the couch where he had leaned. My fingers tingled. Not from longing, but from memory. I spent the rest of the day in silence. No music. No television. Just the sound of my own thoughts echoing in rooms that used to feel full. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the quiet ticking of the clock drilling into me. Something inside me had shifted. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shift it back. Days passed in quiet repetition. I returned to my yoga class as if nothing had happened, falling back into the routine of stretching and breathing and counting minutes, but everything inside me had changed. The walls of the studio, once a place of refuge, now pressed in on me. Every corner whispered memories. Every breath reminded me of the moment that shifted everything. He wasn't there. For 2 sessions, his mat remained empty. I kept telling myself it didn't matter. That I was relieved. That distance was good. But the truth pulsed underneath. I was waiting. Hoping. Dreading. At home, life settled into its rhythm again. My husband asked how the classes were going. I told him they were fine. He nodded. Our evenings blurred together into dinners eaten in front of the TV and quiet exchanges about errands and appointments. He didn't notice the way I avoided eye contact. Or maybe he did and chose not to say anything. Silence can be a form of self-preservation. I deleted his number from my phone. But I remembered it. Every digit. I told myself I wouldn't reach out. I had already crossed a line, and going further would only make everything harder. I clung to the idea of control, even as I felt it slipping through my fingers. Then, one morning, a message. I saw the notification while folding laundry. A name I recognized immediately, even though I had tried so hard to erase it. I'm sorry for the silence. I needed space to think. I stood there, towel half folded, staring at the screen. My heart raced. My fingers trembled. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I let the words sit there, glowing on the screen, like a wound reopening. That night, I wrote a reply. I understand. I needed time too. I didn't send it right away. I read it over a dozen times. I wasn't sure if it was true. But I sent it anyway. The next day, another message. I miss talking to you. I didn't know how to answer. Because I missed it too. More than I wanted to admit. Not just the conversation, but the feeling of being seen. Of being noticed. Of being more than just a fixture in someone's life. But I didn't want to fall again. I had already bruised the fragile surface of my marriage. I told myself I needed to find clarity. To step back. Instead, I stepped deeper in. We met in a quiet cafe on the other side of town. A place where no one knew us. Where the chairs were mismatched and the coffee came in chipped mugs. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of time when people were either working or too tired to pay attention. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting by the window. His expression softened when he saw me. I sat down across from him. For a while, we didn't speak. Just watched people passing by outside, sipping from cups that grew cold too fast. Then he said, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I know, I replied. Neither did I. There was no plan. No agenda. Just two people caught in something neither of them had intended, trying to make sense of the damage. He asked about my family. I told him they were fine. I asked about work. He said it was busy. We spoke like acquaintances. Polite. Careful. But underneath it all was the memory. Of the car. Of the silence. Of the kiss. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. Or the fact that I had spent so many days pretending. But as we stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, I turned to him. We kissed. Not like the first time. This one was slower. More certain. Less about impulse, more about choice. And it terrified me. I pulled back first. Again. My breath shallow. My pulse erratic. I didn't look at him. I just whispered, I have to go. He didn't stop me. Didn't ask me to stay. He just nodded. I walked away quickly, not trusting myself to linger. Back home, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror for a long time. I looked the same. Same lines on my face. Same tired eyes. But something inside me had shifted again. I was losing control. At dinner, my husband told me he had planned a surprise. A getaway. Just the two of us. We need it, he said. You've seemed distant lately. I forced a smile. Agreed. Said it sounded perfect. But I felt panic rising in my chest. He wanted to take me away to reconnect. To find what had faded. But what if I couldn't find it? What if I didn't want to? The next day, the tickets arrived. A weekend at a quiet retreat near the coast. Yoga, nature, silence. Exactly the kind of thing I should have wanted weeks ago. I packed the essentials. Comfortable clothes. A book I wouldn't read. Sunscreen. I stared at my phone for a long time before turning it off. We drove in silence. Not uncomfortable. But not easy either. He reached for my hand at one point. I let him hold it. The retreat was beautiful. Clean air. Tall trees. Rooms with large windows and soft sheets. We settled in. Walked the grounds. Ate in a shared dining hall with other couples who seemed equally eager to reset their lives. That night, we sat by the fireplace in the main lodge. My husband spoke of the early days of our marriage. The trips. The laughter. The mistakes and triumphs. He said he missed that version of us. I listened. I nodded. I smiled. But inside, I was elsewhere. I kept seeing the cafe. The chipped mug. The way the light hit his face through the window. I remembered the way his voice dropped when he said he missed talking to me. And how, even now, I felt like someone who belonged in two lives at once and nowhere fully. Back in our room, I lay beside my husband, eyes open in the dark. He fell asleep quickly, breathing soft and slow. I watched the shadows shift across the ceiling and wondered if I would ever feel certain again. Because the truth was no longer about what had happened. It was about what I had allowed myself to feel. About the questions I couldn't unask. And the worst part was, I didn't regret it. Not fully. Not yet. And maybe that was the real betrayal. The return home was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't offer peace but instead amplifies every little sound, the turning of a key, the soft creak of a stair, the hum of the refrigerator. We unpacked without speaking much. My husband kept glancing at me like he wanted to say something, but the words never came. I knew what he was trying to do. He wanted to bridge the distance. To reach across whatever gap had formed between us. And maybe I should have helped him. But I didn't. Because in the back of my mind, the cafe still existed. So did the chipped mug. So did his eyes, steady and uncertain all at once. I couldn't unfeel what I had felt. And pretending otherwise didn't make it go away. The next few days blurred into routine. Laundry. Groceries. Small talk. My husband suggested we invite our son home for dinner. It's been a while, he said. I nodded, avoiding his eyes. He smiled and sent the message. An hour later, my phone buzzed. He said he'll come, my husband told me, and he's bringing someone with him. The way he said it was casual, offhand, as though he expected me to be pleased. But I froze. Because I knew who that someone was. I busied myself with the menu, with cleaning, with details that didn't need attention. Anything to keep my hands moving. Anything to keep the rising panic from showing on my face. The night of the dinner, I set the table with care. Placed the wine glasses just so. Lit candles. Told myself it was for atmosphere. For warmth. For family. But my hands shook, and I dropped a fork. Bent down slowly, took a deep breath before standing again. They arrived together. My son first through the door, arms open. I hugged him tight, too tight, then turned to face the second figure behind him. He stepped inside as if it were the most natural thing. As if we hadn't shared words in silence and something that shouldn't have existed. His expression was polite. Neutral. Too perfect. My husband welcomed them both. Poured drinks. Led the conversation. I moved on autopilot. Dished out food. Refilled glasses. Smiled in the right places. All while avoiding looking directly at him. but I felt his presence like a pressure on my skin. Dinner passed in fragments. My son joked about work. My husband told stories from the office. I chimed in when needed. Laughed when I was supposed to. Pretended I was fine. But under the table, my leg trembled. There was a moment, just one, when I glanced up and met his eyes. Just a second too long. Just enough to remember. And I saw it reflected back. The weight. The conflict. The regret. After dessert, my son offered to clean up. My husband leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "This was nice," he said. "Feels like old times." I nodded, afraid my voice would betray me. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "You know, we should do this more often. Maybe even a trip. The four of us. What do you think?" My son beamed. "That'd be great." I forced a smile. "Sure. Sounds lovely." But inside, I was unraveling. When they left, I stood at the door longer than I should have, watching taillights disappear into the dark. My husband came up behind me, placed a hand on my shoulder. "I think he's good for our son," he said. "Grounded. Smart." I nodded. "He reminds me of someone," he added, almost to himself. "I just can't place who." I said nothing. Just closed the door. Later that night, I checked my phone. No messages. But I kept looking. As though one might appear if I stared long enough. It didn't. The next day, I found a note in the mailbox. Not an email. Not a text. A folded piece of paper, tucked carefully between bills. I shouldn't have come. I didn't expect it to feel like that. "I'm sorry." No name. No signature. But I didn't need one. I read it 3 times, then tore it in half. Threw it in the trash. Walked away. And then went back. Took the pieces out. Pressed them together. Read it again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside my husband, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. A sound I had once found comforting. Now it only made me feel farther away. At some point, I slipped out of bed. Poured myself a glass of water. Stared out the kitchen window at nothing. The garden was still. Silent. Peaceful. But inside me, everything churned. Because the truth wasn't about a kiss anymore. It wasn't about moments or notes or stolen glances. It was about something much harder to name. A part of me had come alive again. A part one hadn't even realized was asleep. And now that I'd felt it, I couldn't forget it. And I didn't know how to live with that. Or without it. And I knew this wasn't over yet. The morning after the dinner, I woke with a sense of weight pressing on my chest. It wasn't physical, not exactly, it was a sensation, heavy and dull, like my body was refusing to forget what I had tried to bury the night before. My husband was already out of bed, his side cold. I could hear the low murmur of the television from downstairs, mingled with the sound of his spoon tapping against a coffee mug. I stayed in bed longer than I needed to, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many more days I could pretend to be comfortable inside a version of my life that had quietly shifted into something I barely recognized. Eventually, I got up. I went through the motions: shower, towel, moisturizer, light makeup, clothes that looked effortless but had taken me 10 minutes of deliberation to choose. I made myself a cup of tea, the scent of chamomile rising like a ghost of calm I couldn't quite grasp. When I stepped into the living room, my husband looked up from the news. "Morning," he said. I smiled and sat on the arm of the couch. "Morning." "I was thinking," he began, We haven't taken a proper trip with our son in years. What if we all went somewhere? The three of us. Maybe his friend, too. They're close. It'd be nice to do something as a group. I felt the corners of my mouth tighten. Where would we go? I thought Barcelona. You always said you loved it there. I hadn't said that in a decade. Maybe more. But I nodded. He smiled, pleased. I'll look into flights. Just like that, a plan began forming. One I hadn't asked for. One I wasn't ready for. But I nodded again. What else could I do? Later that day, I found myself staring at my phone, the last text still there, unsent. I deleted it. Then rewrote it. When we saw each other, it felt like something broke open again. I can't stop thinking about it. But I don't know what to do. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I hit send. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, a response. Let's meet. Just talk. No pressure. Just you and me. My hands trembled as I read it. I didn't reply. Not right away. I waited until my husband said he'd be gone for the afternoon, some meeting across town, and then I sent back 3 words. Where and when? We met in a quiet part of the city, far from the places we usually haunted. It was an old bookstore cafe, faded rugs, crooked shelves, low light. I arrived early and sat in a booth with a chipped teacup in front of me. When he walked in, I saw the hesitation in his steps, the uncertainty in his shoulders. It mirrored mine. He sat across from me. We didn't hug. We didn't touch. I thought I'd be stronger, I said quietly. So did I, he replied. The words came slowly. Honest. Stripped of pretenses. He told me he hadn't stopped thinking about me. That every time he tried to walk away in his mind, he found himself circling back. I told him I felt the same. That I didn't know what any of it meant, only that it was real. That pretending it wasn't would be a lie I couldn't keep telling. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I didn't need to ask. It was a travel itinerary. A suggestion. A risk. One night, he said. Away. No expectations. Just space. To figure out what this is. To breathe. I stared at the paper but didn't touch it. I'm not making a promise, he said. I need to know if this is something I've invented in my head or if you feel it too. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence said everything. We parted with no more words. I took the paper home, tucked it inside a book I hadn't opened in years, and went about my day like nothing had happened. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, unable to sleep. His arm rested lightly across my stomach, familiar and warm. But my mind was already elsewhere, somewhere in the future, somewhere uncertain. The next few days passed like fog. I went through my schedule, crossed off to-do lists, replied to emails. But everything was muted. Like I was walking underwater. Then came the message, it's tomorrow. If you're coming, I'll be there. I didn't answer. But I packed a small bag that night. Nothing too bold. Neutral colors. Comfortable shoes. A book I wouldn't open. The next day, I told my husband I was meeting an old friend for lunch and might be late. He didn't question it. Kissed my cheek and reminded me to take an umbrella. I took a taxi. The city blurred past the windows. I checked my reflection once, adjusted my scarf, and stepped out at the edge of an unfamiliar neighborhood. He was already there. standing beside a modest hotel entrance, hands in his pockets. We didn't speak. Just walked inside, the door clicking softly behind us. At the desk, he gave his name. We took the elevator up in silence. The hallway was quiet. Narrow. A single window at the end let in the afternoon light. We entered the room. It was simple. Clean. A bed, a chair, a lamp. He closed the door behind us. For a moment, we just stood there. Then, without a word, we spent the night together. No declarations. No drama. Just silence and presence. In the morning, we woke early. The city was still dark outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. He handed me a cup of coffee. "I don't regret it," he said softly. I didn't answer. Because I didn't regret it either. But that didn't make it simple. That didn't make it right. And I didn't know what came next. The morning after, I moved through the city like someone who had just stepped back into her own life but no longer fit inside it. The streets looked the same, but I felt different, altered in ways I couldn't name. I took a long walk before heading home. The air was cool, and I kept my coat wrapped tightly around me, as if I could contain everything inside that still hadn't settled. My mind replayed the night in fragments, like pieces of a film I didn't know how to edit. I got home just before noon. My husband was in the backyard, trimming a few low branches from the fig tree we had planted years ago. He glanced up when he heard the door and waved with a smile. There was no suspicion in his face. No question in his eyes. Just trust. That kind of trust that had once comforted me. Now, it made something twist in my stomach. I kissed him lightly on the cheek and told him I had missed him. The words didn't taste like lies. They just tasted incomplete. I didn't know what I was anymore. A woman caught between what she'd chosen and what she hadn't meant to choose. Between a love built over time and a connection that came uninvited and didn't ask permission to take root. He asked if I wanted to go for lunch together. I agreed. We drove to a small cafe near the pier, a place we hadn't visited in years. The kind of spot we used to frequent when we were younger, when everything was new and untested. As we sat down, he took my hand across the table. His thumb brushed against my fingers. "You seem lighter," he said. "Do I?" I asked, surprised by the way my voice sounded, calm even. "Yeah. Like something's changed." I smiled but said nothing. Maybe he thought the change was about us. That the trip he had planned had helped me reconnect. Maybe, in a way, he was right. I had reconnected. Just not with him. That night, as he slept beside me, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. I thought of the hotel room. Of the silence. Of the stillness afterward that felt more honest than anything I had felt in months. I thought of his voice when he whispered, "I don't regret it," and how my silence in return had said more than any confession. But life didn't stop for reflection. The next morning brought emails, errands, and another round of family plans. My son messaged to say he'd be home soon and asked if we could all have dinner together again, him, yes, and his friend. I stared at the message longer than I should have. When I told my husband, he was delighted. "Perfect timing," he said. "Let's do something special." And just like that, a new dinner was set in motion. Another evening where the four of us would share a table while pretending not to feel everything pulsing underneath. I spent the day preparing. Shopping, cleaning, marinating, checking every little detail twice. Not because I cared about perfection, but because keeping busy was the only way I knew how to survive what was coming. They arrived right on time. My son beamed. His friend, *he*, stood behind him, smiling with practiced ease. When our eyes met, it was brief. Calculated. As if we had never touched. As if that night had existed in a different version of time. Dinner began like all family dinners do, loud laughter, overlapping stories, hands reaching for bread, wine poured into glasses too quickly. I sat between my son and my husband, across from him. The space between us was filled with conversation, but it felt like a chasm. At one point, my son stepped away to take a call. My husband got up to fetch more wine. And just like that, we were alone for 10 seconds. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said a word. But the silence roared. Later, after the dishes were cleared and everyone had retreated into their own corners of the house, I found myself in the kitchen, rinsing a glass that didn't need rinsing. I heard footsteps. Turned. It was him. He stood in the doorway, the overhead light casting soft shadows across his face. He didn't move. I didn't think it would be this hard, he said quietly. I know, I replied. He took a step closer. Do you regret it? The question hung in the air, thick and impossible. No, I said. But I don't know what to do with it. He nodded, his jaw tight. I can't stop thinking about you, he said. I closed my eyes, just for a second. Don't. Why not? Because I can't change what's real. And what's real is, this life. My life. Him. Our son. Everything we've built. But that night happened, I cut in. But it didn't erase anything else. There was silence again. I didn't mean to fall into this, he said. But I did. So did I whispered. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded once, turned, and left the kitchen. I stood there long after he was gone, staring at the sink, the water still running over my hands. When I finally went to bed, my husband was already asleep. I slid under the covers carefully, as if afraid to wake him. But the truth was, I was afraid to face him. Afraid he would look at me one day and see the truth. Not in a text. Not in a moment of suspicion. But in my eyes. I turned off the light and lay there in the dark. Not grieving. Not afraid. Just empty. And I realized that emptiness wasn't about what I had done. It was about what I could never have. What I could never keep. Because some things aren't meant to be held. Some things are just meant to break you open and leave you wondering what's left. The days that followed felt like I was walking along the edge of something fragile, something that could crack with the smallest wrong move. My body moved through routines, cooking, folding laundry, answering emails, but my mind was elsewhere, lost in the memory of things that shouldn't have happened and the tension of things that still might. I tried to refocus myself on home. On my husband. On being present. But it was like trying to pour water into a vessel with a hairline fracture. No matter how careful I was, something always leaked out. I caught myself zoning out mid-conversation. Forgetting simple tasks. Laughing too loudly at the wrong time. He didn't mention it, but I knew he noticed. His glances lingered a bit longer, his questions came a bit softer. One morning, I caught him looking at me across the breakfast table as I stirred sugar into my coffee. His face was unreadable. What? I asked, trying to sound light. He smiled faintly. You seem far away lately. I forced a smile back. Just tired, I guess. He nodded, but the way he looked down at his plate made it clear that he didn't believe me. Or maybe he did. Maybe he just didn't want to push. I wasn't sure which was worse. That night, after he had gone to bed, I sat in the dark living room with a cup of cold tea and stared at the silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of wood as the house settled, it was all too familiar. And yet, it felt like someone else's life. A version of mine I could no longer fully step into. I opened my phone. I didn't intend to send anything. Just to look. Just to remember. But the message was already there, waiting. Are you okay? 4 words. I stared at them for a long time, then typed back. No. I don't think I am. A few seconds later, the dots appeared. Want to go somewhere? I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the blinking lights, knowing that saying yes would pull me deeper, but also knowing that silence wouldn't save me either. Finally, I typed, where? He sent the name of a park on the edge of town. One we used to take our son to when he was little. I hadn't been there in years. The next day, I said I had errands to run. My husband didn't question it. He kissed my forehead and told me to grab milk on the way back. The park was nearly empty, the air cool and damp from the morning fog. I walked along the paved path slowly, not sure if I wanted to be found or forgotten. When I saw him sitting on a bench under a willow tree, my heart jumped in my chest. He stood when I approached but didn't reach out. We sat in silence for a while, watching 2 kids chase a pigeon across the grass. Finally, he spoke. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, he said. Me neither. He looked at me. Do you want to stop this? I swallowed hard. I don't know what this even is. He nodded, as if that was the answer he expected. It's getting harder. Yes. He turned toward me fully. I'm not asking for anything. I can't pretend it doesn't exist. I blinked slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle on my chest. I've tried to go back to before, I said. To reset. But I can't. Because it's already happened. Because I'm already different. We sat there for what felt like forever. Eventually, he placed something on the bench between us. A small folded piece of paper. I wrote something. You don't have to read it now. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't. I'll go, he said. Take care of yourself. And then he left. I sat there for several more minutes, staring at the folded note. I didn't open it until I got home, alone in the bedroom with the door locked. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't even a confession. It was a story. A story about a woman he knew who once said yes when she should have said no, and how the yes wasn't about desire, it was about breath. About remembering she had lungs. That she was still alive. I folded the paper back up and placed it in the drawer beside the bed. That evening, my husband suggested we go out to dinner, just the 2 of us. I agreed. At the restaurant, everything was lit with warm yellow light. The kind meant to make you feel cozy and safe. The kind that hides things in the shadows. He ordered wine. I asked for sparkling water. As we waited for our food, he reached across the table and took my hand. I miss us, he said. I looked down at our fingers, intertwined. I know. We've been through so much together. I nodded. Do you still love me? It was the kind of question people ask when they already suspect the answer. Yes, I said. And it was true. But not the whole truth. Later, in the car, he played a song we used to listen to on long drives. I stared out the window, watching our city blur past, wondering how many people were hiding lives behind polite smiles and quiet routines. When we got home, he went to bed early. Said he had a headache. I stayed downstairs, again, in the same chair, in the same silence. I pulled out the paper. Read it again. Then I burned it over the kitchen sink. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just watched the flames curl the edges of the page and turn it into something weightless. When I went upstairs, I found him already asleep, one arm draped over the empty space beside him. I lay down next to him. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in weeks, I slept. But in my dreams, I was still walking through that park, and the bench was always empty when I got there. I didn't hear from him for days after I burned the letter. And I didn't reach out either. A part of me wanted to. There were moments, short, sharp seconds, where I would catch myself picking up the phone, half composing a message I never intended to send. But I didn't. I sat with the silence, let it settle over me like dust. It wasn't peace. It was distance. And maybe I needed that more than I realized. Life returned to something that looked like normal. I went to yoga again, carefully scanning the room before each class. He wasn't there. His mat had been replaced by someone new. A woman I didn't recognize, young and full of the kind of stillness I remembered craving when I first started. I envied her, not her age or flexibility, but her emptiness. She hadn't yet filled her life with too many mistakes to stretch around. At home, my husband had grown more attentive. He brought me coffee in the mornings. Suggested short walks after dinner. Started leaving me small notes, on the fridge, in my coat pocket, beside the sink. Things like, thinking of you, or you looked beautiful last night. I wanted to respond in kind, but the part of me that used to rise to meet him in those moments felt numb. Not dead, not cold, just far away. Our son came home again for a weekend. He brought friends. They laughed loudly, played old music, filled the house with life that hadn't been there in months. I watched from the kitchen, smiled when they caught me looking. I wondered how much he knew, how much he had guessed. Not about the details, but the change in me. Sons can feel those things, even when no one tells them. Later that evening, my husband announced he had planned a dinner. Not just for the family, but for everyone. He invited our son's friends, a few neighbors, even some old colleagues. A celebration, he called it. Just because we need one. I nodded and offered to cook. He said no, that he'd take care of everything. The night came quickly. The house was filled with people. Laughter. Glasses clinking. Music soft and warm in the background. I floated through the rooms like a hostess. I refilled drinks, asked polite questions, smiled in all the right places. Then I saw him. He arrived late. I don't know who invited him, maybe my son, maybe someone else. But there he was. Standing in my kitchen like he belonged, like nothing had ever passed between us. Our eyes met only for a moment. I looked away before anything else could surface. He blended in easily, speaking to my son, nodding to my husband, greeting the neighbors like he had done it 100 times before. I watched him from the edge of the room. There was no tension in his shoulders, no tremble in his hands. If he was uncomfortable, he didn't show it. I avoided him the entire evening. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I didn't trust myself to know what I'd say. At some point, my husband stood and raised his glass. To all of us, he said. To home, to family, to the things that change and the things that hold us steady. Everyone cheered. I held my glass too, but didn't drink. I was focused on his face just for a second. He was looking at me. Not smiling. Not sad. Just looking. Later, when the guests began to leave and the noise faded into quiet goodbyes, I escaped to the backyard. The air was cooler than expected. Crisp. Still. I stood by the fig tree, running my hand along one of the branches my husband had trimmed weeks ago. It had started to grow again, new shoots, soft and green. I watched them for a moment, wondering how something could begin again so easily. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. I knew who it was. "You looked peaceful tonight," he said. I closed my eyes. I didn't feel peaceful. I know. We stood in silence. Not the charged kind that asks for more, but the quiet of two people who have already said too much. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said eventually. "I didn't expect to come." "Why did you?" He didn't answer right away. "Because part of me hoped you'd still look at me like you used to." I breathed slowly, letting the words land. "And did I?" He stepped a little closer. "Yes. Just for a second." I didn't know what to say. There was nothing left to say. He took another step, then stopped. "I'm leaving town." That made me turn. "What?" "Work. A new position. Out of state." My mouth was dry. "When?" "End of the month." I nodded, trying to anchor myself in the sound of wind moving through the leaves. "Is it what you want?" I asked. "It's what I need." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel that pull in my chest. I felt release. "I'm glad," I said. "Really?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I just needed to see you. One last time. Not to change anything. Just to close it." "Then let's close it," I whispered. He stepped back, nodded once, and walked toward the house. I didn't follow. I stayed by the tree until the door clicked shut. When I came back inside, my husband was in the kitchen, humming softly as he cleaned up. He looked up when I entered. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Yes." He handed me a towel, and we cleaned in silence. Side by side. No need to ask more. No need to explain. That night, as we got into bed, I felt his hand find mine beneath the covers. His grip was gentle. Familiar. Real. And I held on. In the weeks that followed, the house grew quieter, though nothing had changed in appearance. The same curtains fluttered in the same breeze. The same mugs lined the cabinet, and my husband's keys still clinked against the hallway table each evening. But something inside me had shifted permanently, like a photograph slightly faded from sunlight, not ruined, but changed in tone forever. I kept thinking about that night in the backyard. The way he said goodbye without asking for more. The way I didn't cry or panic or run after him. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was closure. A full stop. A breath let out after months of holding it in. True to his word, he left town. There was no announcement, no farewell party. Just a message from my son days later: he took the new job. Left this morning. I responded with a simple, "I wish him well." Nothing more. I didn't keep anything from him. No photos, no objects, no hidden notes. The only souvenir I carried was the version of myself I had become because of it all, someone more awake, more uncertain, but no longer invisible. There were still moments, of course. Moments when I would pause in the middle of folding towels or stirring soup and feel the echo of his presence. But they were like aftershocks, reminders of something that had already passed. What surprised me most was how my husband responded to the quiet that followed. It was as if, without knowing what had happened, he still sensed the space that had been made and moved into it with gentle steps. One morning, he invited me to walk with him. No destination. Just two people moving side by side. We passed familiar streets, spoke little, and didn't need to say much. His hand brushed mine a few times, and eventually, I let our fingers entwine. That afternoon, I cleaned out a drawer in the study and came across an old journal. I flipped through it slowly, pages filled with scribbled thoughts from years ago. Notes about the garden. Recipes I never tried. A list of books I meant to read. And in between them, a single sentence I had written and circled twice. Don't disappear inside what you've built. I sat with that for a long time. The life I had built wasn't wrong. It wasn't broken. But somewhere along the way, I had let myself vanish within it, quietly, respectfully, without resistance. The affair, if that's even what it was, hadn't been a rebellion. It had been a reawakening. A disruption that forced me to see myself again, to hear my own thoughts, to feel my own pulse. And now, with that chapter closed, I faced a different question, not about love or betrayal, but about presence. About choosing to remain present in the life I still had. One evening, my husband came home with 2 tickets to a weekend retreat. Not the kind of retreat filled with lectures or workshops. Just a quiet cabin by the lake. No Wi-Fi. No obligations. I thought it might be good, he said, placing the tickets on the counter. I nodded slowly. It might. And so we went. The drive was long and quiet, the kind that gives space for things to breathe. We listened to old music, shared stories we hadn't told in years, and laughed, not in the forced way we had in recent months, but honestly, like something between us had softened. At the cabin, we cooked simple meals, read, sat in silence. One night, we built a fire and sat beside it, wrapped in separate blankets, staring into the flames. He reached for my hand, and I didn't pull away. I'm glad we came, he said softly. Me too. I didn't tell him about the journal. Or the circled sentence. But I thought about it as we sat there. When we returned home, I felt lighter. Not fixed, not new, but present. And maybe that was enough. Weeks passed. Summer faded into the early touches of autumn. Leaves began to fall. The air grew crisp again, and I found myself walking more, watching the colors change slowly. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend from the yoga studio. We talked for a while on the sidewalk, caught up on names and places and things people were doing. Have you seen him? She asked eventually, casually. I shook my head. He moved. She nodded. Makes sense. He was always restless. I smiled faintly. Some of us have to leave to find out where we belong. And that was the end of it. I didn't go back to that studio. Instead, I joined a class closer to home. I didn't look for him. I didn't try to follow where he had gone. Instead, I stayed. Stayed in the life I had nearly stepped out of. Stayed in the house with the man who still brought me coffee and told me I was beautiful without irony. Stayed inside the version of myself that had learned how to live in contradiction, how to hold guilt and grace at the same time, how to feel both loss and relief in the same breath. One morning, as I sat by the window drinking tea, I watched a young couple across the street move into a newly sold house. They carried boxes together, laughing about something I couldn't hear. I thought about beginnings. About how they rarely announce themselves. And how, sometimes, they come after endings. Quietly. Softly. Almost like forgiveness. And I closed my eyes. Not in sorrow. Not in shame. But in peace.
Bye-bye.